So far we've taken a look at the link field, which allows us to link to an object or a selection, and then the routes drop down. And this allows us to control the number of guides, the segments that the guides will have, the length of the guides, also where the guides will be grown, and how these will be mapped to the surface if the geometry changes, or if the route type changes as well. The next submenu that we have is the growth submenu. And what this is going to allow us to control is what direction these guides are drawn when we add them or make changes. By default, the growth is going to be set to normals. And what this does is it simply takes a guide and pushes it out along the normal of any polygon that it's growing on. If we select the pelt and go into the polygon tool, and then select all polygons, you'll see that all polygons are currently facing up. And the reverse side, indicated by blue here, is pointing down. So all hairs that have grown on this object are pointing along the normal of our polygons. If I was to choose the live selection tool and then select a group of polygons here, right-click and choose reverse normals, this is going to change the normal direction. So if we select all polygons again, you'll see that some polygons are facing up and some are facing down. If I go to the hair object and then click on the editing submenu and choose regrow, which essentially is like adding the hair to the object again, you'll see that the guides now point in the direction of the normals that we set. So the normals that are pointing up have hair pointing up. The normals that are pointing down have hair pointing down. The next option that we have under growth is direction. And if we choose direction, you'll see that the axis and the local checkbox become available for us to work with. Let's just adjust the viewport a bit here so that we can see from the top of our object again. And with the axis set to X, we will once again go to the editing submenu here and choose regrow. And you'll see that now all hair is grown moving along the X plus axis, so from left to right. If we set the axis to Y and then click on regrow, you'll see that all the hairs are growing straight up and down, or in line with the Y-axis. The Z-axis is the same thing. So now all the hairs have grown in line with the Z-axis. The reason that there is a local checkbox is because all of these axes are aligning to their corresponding world axis. What this means is if I take, say, the pelt, and rotate this a bit on the pitch or on the x-axis, then go back to the hair object, choose axis direction Y, and then click regrow, you'll see that all the hairs still grow straight up and down, even though the object itself is tilted. If I enable the local checkbox and click regrow again, you'll see now the hair is growing along the local axis of my object. And if we switch to the Move tool, you can see that a bit better. So the hairs are now aligned to the Y-axis of my object. Finally, the last option that we have is random. If we click Regrow, you'll see that every guide, although still growing from the same position, now has a completely random direction of growth off of the surface. The next option that we have here in the Growth submenu is minimum spacing. And we can enable minimum spacing at the moment, and nothing is going to change in our scene. And this is because the roots are locked to the polygon vertex. And what minimum spacing really wants to do is look at the distance between two guides and try to maintain that as a minimum distance between guides. Since polygon vertex doesn't allow us to actually change the position of the guide, we need to set the root to something that will. So we'll switch that to polygon area. And then we'll move to the top view just so we can get a good idea of the distribution of these guides across the surface. So with just the default settings, you'll see that we do have some areas where there are large gaps. This is where there's no guides. And then we have areas where we get guides very close together. And this is going to be something that really changes as we increase the count. So let's start by turning minimum spacing off and then increasing the count. you'll see that the result that we get is still something that's very random. We can have these large gaps, which happen completely randomly, and we also have these little clusters of guides. And these little clusters are where the minimum spacing comes into play. If we check minimum spacing now, you'll see that the distribution that I get for the guides is a lot cleaner and more even. And that's because it's simply looking at every guide and making sure that there is no guide within 0.5 inches of that guide. Now, this process can get fairly slow because it's going through every single guide on the object and then trying to adjust the spacing, and then it's doing that again until it finds a fairly decent solution. So where can you find some control over this then? In the Advanced tab, you have an option here called Redistribute Loops. And this is going to be the number of iterations that Cinema 4D will go through to try and come to this resolution. You can go all the way up to 1,000, but if you do that, you might not always get different results, but you definitely will get slower response. So a good practice here is to start low and then slowly bump this setting up until you do get the effect that you're looking for. Back in the Guides tab, you'll also want to do the same thing with the distance. If we set the distance to something totally unrealistic, like say 30 inches, there is no way that it can keep all of the guides 30 inches away from each other and still keep the proper number, which is 709, on this surface. So it essentially just breaks the function. So you do have to find a good balance between the number of guides and the distance that you want to set here. The next option that we have here is density. And this is going to work with a texture mapper shader that you can specify using the shader slot that you can see right here. So let's go ahead and add a simple noise shader. And we can click on the button here to bring up the details for the noise shader itself. We'll start by clipping the low and high values, just so we get something that's a little bit more contrasty, and we can up the global scale. We'll click on the up arrow to bring us back to the hair object. And if we click on Regrow, you'll see that nothing has really happened to the object again. And that's because the density field here is something that wants to work with a UV map. So again, we're going to click on the material for our pelt, make sure this is set to flat, and then check our texture axis. We can go to the Tags menu and choose Fit to Object to get that to snap to the size of the object, and then Tags generate UVW coordinates so that we get proper UVs out of that. We can click back to the Model tool and then to the hair again, and let's try regrowing the hair. So again, you'll see that nothing has regrown. We can turn off the minimum spacing, and that was trying to push all of our hairs away. So it is important to make sure that your settings in minimum spacing don't conflict with your settings in the density here. At this point, you have levels, and this is essentially like posterizing the shader or image that you're using. So the number of levels changes the number of density levels we can have here. So 2 is essentially just giving us black and white, or a nice hard edge. As we increase this value, you'll see that the density on the edge around here is something that gets a lot softer. And if we increase the number of guides so that we have a denser view of this, you can see how that really affects things. We can go into our noise again and maybe change the clipping a little bit so it's not as extreme. And then back up to the density and readjust the levels. So you'll see the more levels you have, the smoother your edge transition will be. If you just need really rough transitions though, keep the levels set to something low.